Welcome to the Foul Play YouTube channel.
Hey everyone, it's good to be here with this worldwide calamity regarding the coronavirus. And let's hope to God that we can do the podcast all in one piece. Well, look, guys, welcome. Welcome to Coffee with Foul Play. And the title of the podcast today is Let's Work with KZ, episode number 2. Welcome, beautiful people. And of course, before we start the podcast proper, I just wish everyone the very best regarding this coronavirus infection. I hope it subsides really quickly. It's obviously had a worldwide effect. And a lot of people don't know what's happening. But I know that in Australia, we've essentially run out of toilet paper and hand sanitizer. So the important thing, guys, is with the coronavirus, proper hygiene is very important. Really, all you got to do is to make sure that you wash your hands and keep proper hygiene. And the virus itself does not affect your GI tract. So you don't really need a lot of toilet paper. But yes, in Australia, we've run out of toilet paper and also hand sanitizer. But wait, I heard a nasty rumor. Is it true that Disneyland has been shut down? Who lives near Disneyland?
I do. I live literally 5 minutes away from Disneyland in Southern California, and
no.
it's closed.
Oh no!
And, yes. And so the schools, we have 500,000 kids staying home for the next 3 weeks. As of Friday, yeah.
So wait a minute,
it's
no
real.
Disneyland. No Disneyland.
No kids licking the rails or spitting or picking up gum from the floor. No.
Oh no. Well, we have to cancel the podcast now. No Disneyland. The world's in a calamity.
Disneyland.
All right. All right, guys. Well, look, let's see if we can get this podcast done in one piece. It is a very important podcast, this one. And guys, joining me on the podcast today, we have our regular researchers. We have BB, Jack 61, we have Neverly, and we have Spooky 67. Monitoring the chat, fielding your questions, and feel free to ask as many questions as possible. We'll try and answer them after I do the introduction to the podcast. We have Catnip, Lily, Sammy, and Zoe. And today, guys, I'm really pleased to welcome our guest researchers. We have Nan's Life, and we also have the return of One Strand in the Rav. At the moment, our Foul Play server YouTube channel has 897 subscribers. And all of us want to thank you guys for supporting us, for all your comments. It's been awesome. And our YouTube channel has had over 252,000 views. And that's awesome. We also have a website, www.foulplay.site, and you're quite welcome to have a look. There's a lot of information present on the website, and we welcome comments and feedback. Guys, if you like what we do, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel. Now, as I've always said in all of our podcasts, we're not perfect. Sometimes we do make a mistake, we do make an error. If you spot one, hey, we're more than happy to correct it. The important thing, guys, is to give proper information, especially about the cases, to the general public. All right, now, guys, before we start the podcast proper, Nan's Life, if I can ask you, what attracted you to the Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey cases? Nan's Life.
Yeah, when I first seen it advertised just before Christmas, I thought, wow, this might be a great storyline to follow. And I
Yes.
watched it, and then I found the court documents, and then I watched it again, and I watched it without volume just to be able to look at all the characters and see what they were doing. And I fell in the rabbit hole, and I'm still down in there somewhere.
Oh, no. So, Nan's life, are you trying to tell me you're addicted?
Possibly, yeah.
Well, thank God none of us are on that
No.
channel. We have a normal, regular life, right, guys? Of course we do. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nan's life. And I believe we've spoken with One Strand in the Rav previously. Do you want to make any comments at all before we start the podcast, One Strand? All good?
Yeah, no, just that even with just the last week, I've learned so much more from being a part of foul play, and encourage anybody who wants to help in this situation to join in, learn, participate. Everybody is more than welcoming, and to teach you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Yeah, we try and have a community over here. We work well together as a team, and I'm just so proud of everyone that's on the panel and part of Foul Play. All right, guys, we'll make a start. Now, I just want to, before we do make a start, I just want to point out that the start or the presentation today is going to be a bit of a lengthy one, but there's a lot of very important information in podcast number 2. And remember, what we're dealing with here, guys, is we're focusing on Stephen Avery. We're looking at Kathleen Zellner and the way she's approached this case, especially looking at the forensic evidence. So, guys, what we'll do, we'll make a start with slide number 1. So if you have any questions, write them down, and the guys will check your questions. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go through it. All right, guys, so let's start with slide number 1. And it's rather amazing. And now thinking about it, Kathleen Zellner actually made some very pertinent comments about Brendan Dassey. And we all know about poor Brendan. He's in prison for life, essentially, and he won't be released, I think, till 2048 for his role in the so-called murder of Teresa Halbach. Now, remember, there is no forensic evidence against Brendan Dassey. And Kathleen Zellner made a couple of very important comments, and I didn't really understand the significance until now. And Kathleen Zellner stated that Brendan Dassey, and I quote, was just a tool that was used to frame Stephen Avery. And he was another piece of the planted evidence. And that made me think that's correct. Brendan Dassey is another piece of the planted evidence against Stephen Avery. And through these podcasts, we're going to reveal what that planted evidence was. And the important thing, the important comment that Kathleen Zellner made regarding Brendan was, and I quote, "They planted this story in his brain and got him to agree with it." And it's really the final comment which is so pertinent, and I think all of us guys will agree, and that is the court system in Wisconsin, I think, is just shocking. So Kathleen Zellner is working in this very hostile environment, working for her client, Stephen Avery. Now, remember, in the first podcast, we talked about the forensic evidence. If you look through the trial testimonies, if you go through CASO, you'll realize that the majority of the evidence is all DNA based. So guys, let's have a look at slide number 2. Now, what Kathleen Zellner did, which was a very smart move on her behalf, was that she consulted with a forensic DNA expert, and in this case, Dr. Carl Reich. Kathleen Zellner said to Carl Reich, "Okay, I want you to look over this case and find anomalies, things that don't quite fit, data, results, things that can be questioned. And Dr. Carl Wright said there is more than a handful of those. So he obviously went through all the forensic DNA reports, and he found a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of anomalies. Let's have a look at slide number 3. So the first thing that the expert looked at was the actual blood in the Toyota RAV4. So this is slide number 3. Now, what is obvious, and we discussed this in our first podcast, is that if you look at the blood in the Toyota RAV4, what you'll find is that there is blood in the back cargo area. That blood belongs to Teresa Hallbach. Now, remember, DNA was extracted from the blood and a full genomic DNA profile was obtained, and it was compared to the intimate sample or the pap smear. So those DNA samples were 100% matched to the pap smear. So in the back of the RAV is Teresa Hallbach's blood, allegedly. Now, what we find at the front of the RAV, there's 6 droplets and also flakes of blood that allegedly belong to Stephen Avery. So what you note here, guys, is that you have a division of where the blood is. You have the victim's blood in the back of the RAV. You have Stephen Avery's blood in the front of the RAV. And there appears to be no mixing of the blood. Now, if you look at the state's case surmises that both Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey had murdered Teresa Hallbach, and according to Brendan Dassey, they had shot Teresa Hallbach, I think, 10 or 11 times, including in the head. They cut her throat, stabbed her several times. One would imagine that there would be blood absolutely everywhere. So potentially you can have get blood on your shoes, you can get blood on your hands, and you're likely transferring blood from the victim onto yourself and vice versa. But you don't find that in the RAV. You find 6 discrete droplets or flakes of blood belonging to Stephen Avery, and you find the victim's blood in the back of the RAV. So if we have a look at slide number 4, the DNA expert and also Kathleen Zellner asked a very important question. If you look at the blood in the RAV, why is there no mixture, right? One would expect there to be a mixture of bloods, that is Stephen Avery's blood and Teresa Hallbach's blood. But whenever Cherie Culhane had isolated the DNA from the blood, she only found unique profiles. There was no mixing. So Dr. Carl Wright asked the obvious question, well, why isn't there a mixture of blood? Kathleen Zellner rightly stated that is a huge red flag. I mean, these people have looked at murder scenes before, and in the majority of cases, there is a mixture of blood between the perpetrator and the victim. But in this case, there isn't. So Kathleen Zellner surmised that the prosecution needed to have another body fluid somewhere else on the vehicle. And this is very, very interesting, because think about it, guys. If there was just the blood in the Toyota RAV4, Stephen Avery potentially could have come up with a perfect excuse to explain why his blood was in the car. But of course, Stephen Avery showed shock and surprise when Fassbender and Wiegert told him, what is your DNA doing in her car? What's her blood doing in your trailer? So he was genuinely shocked and surprised, and he never gave any excuse or any reason. So if we have a look at slide number 5, This is very, very important. And it's entitled, What's Under the Hood? Now, we know that Brendan Dassey got interrogated several times. He gave many, many different interviews with both Fassbender and Wiegert. Now, they kept on pressuring Brendan about what had occurred under the hood of the car. Now, it's pretty obvious that Fassbender and Wiegert would have known that the battery cables had become disconnected under the hood of the Toyota RAV4. And they kept on questioning Brendan what occurred under the hood. And Fassbender came out and said, what did he do under the hood if that's what he did? So again, it's Fassbender, one of the investigators, supplying privileged information to the person that they're questioning. Exactly when Wiegert questioned Brendan, who shot her in the head. So Brendan eventually said, well, it was Stephen that was under the hood. I didn't know what he did, but he was under the hood. Well, this was fantastic for the investigators, because what they did is they then went back to the RAV4 and they swabbed the hood latch. Now, guys, the important thing here to realize is that Teresa Horbach was reported missing, I think it was November the 3rd. The law enforcement officers, Tyson it actually was, didn't swab the hood latch until 149 days after the Toyota RAV4 was found at the Avery salvage yard. So you think about it, guys. The Toyota RAV4 was brought to the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory, and it was Cherie Cohane that did all the swabbing. Well, it never occurred to Cherie Cohane to swab under the hood, right? So they didn't have any of those in situ swabs at that time. So the hood latch was swabbed at Calumet County Sheriff's Department. So that's where the Toyota RAV4 was being stored at the time. So the important thing here, guys, is that it was Fassbender that told Brendan Dassey about what event occurred under the hood, and the hood latch wasn't swabbed till 149 days later, right? That's important. So, guys, if we turn to slide number 6. So, the hood latch was swabbed by Tyson, and the swab was sent to Cherie Cohane, and she extracted the DNA from the hood latch. And guys, you can read about it. It's called item ID if you have a look at Cherie Cohane's report. And lo and behold, as if magic, the hood latch DNA came back as only belonging to Stephen Avery, and it produced a full genomic DNA profile. And you can see here on the right-hand corner, Kathleen Zellner just laughs, puts her hands up in the air, and says, wow, what a piece of luck that is. And of course, that's extremely suspicious in itself, right? None of the swabbing was originally done underneath the hood. Lo and behold, Fassbender talks to Brendan Dassey. That gives them a new reason to go back to the RAV4, swab the hood latch, and lo and behold, we now have Stephen Avery's DNA present on the hood latch. Now note, nobody else's, only Stephen Avery's DNA is present on the hood latch. So guys, if we turn to page number 6, number 7. Now, what Ken Kratz is actually doing here is describing what Stephen Avery apparently did to get underneath the hood. Now, let's not joke around here, because it was the so-called sweat DNA that convinced a lot of people of Stephen Avery's guilt. And I quote, this is from the Stephen Avery trial, This is Ken Kratz. So when somebody's hands are sweating and you handle something, it's possible that you can leave your DNA on that thing that you handled. You heard a suggestion already in which there will be evidence in this case that the battery was disconnected on Miss Hallbach's vehicle. We'll tell you, or at least we'll argue as to why that happened. But importantly, in reaching up underneath the hood to open up Teresa Hallbach's vehicle, Mr. Avery was kind enough to leave his DNA on the hood latch. Okay? That will come from Cherie Cohen as well. So if I just want to make the comment, again, we have Ken Kratz mocking Stephen Avery, and he said this several times, by stating Mr. Avery was kind enough, right? Now remember, these guys are meant to be forensic gurus. That's both Stephen and Brendan. They incredibly cleaned out their trailer. They also cleaned out their garage. No DNA from themselves, no DNA from Teresa Hallbach, and that's including Ida Merfel, which we talked about previously. You couldn't include that as forensic evidence. It's pure junk. So therefore, we are to believe that both Brendan and Stephen are forensic gurus, yet they leave the crime scene, i.e. the Toyota RAV4, with Stephen Avery's blood, the victim's blood, and also that Stephen Avery was kind enough to leave his so-called sweat DNA underneath the hood, or for the investigators to find out. Okay, so let's have a look at slide number 8. Now remember, Kathleen Zellner had consulted with a DNA expert. And so what the DNA expert wanted to do is a recreation. So what they do is they recreate the event whereby someone is touching the hood latch. So essentially what we're looking here, guys, is a phenomenon called touch DNA. That is, when you touch an object, you potentially can leave skin cells, right? Skin cells on a particular object, and skin cells, they're dead. Normally skin cells are dead, but they contain a nucleus, they contain genomic DNA. You can isolate them. So what the experts did is that they obtained 3 volunteers, each to touch the hood latch, and they were tested 5 times. So every time the volunteer touched the hood latch, they got a swab. They swabbed the hood latch, and then they cleaned the hood latch after each trial, and they repeated it again. So this way, by repeating the trials, you can get an average of how much DNA these 3 volunteers left on the hood latch. Now, the weakness of an experiment like this is obvious, right? The 3 volunteers obviously didn't murder and rape somebody, cremate them, were involved in all these horrible, nefarious activities. They're likely to be laboratory workers. Whereas Stephen Avery, he worked in the salvage yard, and according to Ken Kratz and the state, he did all these horrible things and he murdered Teresa Hallbach, etc., etc. And so you can't perfectly reproduce the conditions. So you need to take that into account when looking at the results, right? So what this experiment will tell us is, can people leave their DNA on the hood latch, and how much DNA is left behind? So let's have a look at slide number 9. So all the samples that they did a PCR, they worked out how much DNA was extracted in total. And what they found was, out of 15 trials that were done, only 4 samples produced DNA. And if you have a look at the samples that produced DNA, the average amount of DNA that was recovered was very, very small. It was on average 0.072 nanograms. So the amount of DNA recovered from the hood latch was extremely small. So this would be from touch DNA. So their fingertips touching the metal hood latch, and only 4 out of 15 samples produced DNA, and it was extremely low. Now, when the DNA expert looked at the swab, the hood latch swab from Stephen Avery, they extracted the DNA, and they were able to work out how much DNA was present on that swab. Well, they were able to recover 1.848 nanograms. And as you can see, it's nearly 26-fold higher than what the average participants were able to deposit. Now, the important thing to realize here, guys, is that yes, Stephen Avery left a huge amount of DNA behind as compared to the other 3 volunteers. But remember, there are many, many factors that you need to take into account, right? Like temperature, the actual skin surface itself. There are many factors, including how the DNA is extracted. There are many complications here. But clearly, what this shows is that Stephen Avery apparently left a huge amount of DNA on that hood latch. There's one important thing here to consider as well, guys. There has been a lot of studies done in which they look at the amount of DNA recovered after a certain period of time. So you can leave DNA on a surface for a number of days and extract it and see how much DNA you can recover. What the scientists discovered was the longer you leave the DNA on the surface, the less DNA you recover, because DNA breaks down. So when you expose it to the elements, when you expose it to bacteria, fungi, the DNA breaks down. So you actually recover less and less. So think about this, guys. The DNA was extracted, or the hood latch was swabbed 149 days after allegedly Stephen Avery had deposited. In actual fact, more, because according to the state, Stephen Avery touched the hood latch on Halloween. So we're looking at over 150 days where the hood latch was then swabbed. So if you take that into account, that means that Stephen Avery must have left his finger there, right? He left a huge amount of DNA when you factor in natural degradation. With the volunteers, they extracted the DNA probably within a day. So their DNA sample represented fresh touch DNA, whereas Stephen Avery's result represented DNA that was close to 150 days old. So it didn't really match as being touch DNA. Now, I know that some guilters are going to put up their hands and say, well, what about shedder status? In other words, do some people leave more skin cells than others? And look, the jury really is out. Some people say yes, people have different shedder status. You can leave a lot more or a lot less DNA than somebody else. And other people disagree because there are so many factors at play here. Clearly, what someone needed to do is to get Stephen Avery to do a trial run, right? Get Stephen Avery to touch the hood latch several times, extract the DNA, and see what type of shedder status he is. But clearly, you can't do that because he's in prison. But at first glance, this is very suspicious because Stephen Avery is leaving behind a huge amount of DNA as compared to 3 other volunteers. So let's have a look at slide number 10. So the DNA expert asked, okay, where did this hood latch DNA actually come from? And we know that from the normal body fluids, it can either be blood, saliva, semen, or urine. There's also now a test where they can detect for the presence of feces as well. So the DNA expert said, look, blood and saliva is a rich source of DNA. So let's have a look at slide 11. Now, this is very, very important. So remember, Tyson swabbed the hood latch and gave the swab to Cherie Cohen. And I quote, this is from the Stephen Avery trial. Question: do you recall when you looked at the swab, did you notice any condition to it as far as color? Answer: it was discolored, but it did not have the appearance. It was not a reddish brown discoloration consistent with blood. That's a very important point. Question: so it did not appear to have blood on the swab? Answer: correct. But you proceeded with DNA testing on the swab, nevertheless? Yes. Now, think about this, guys. This is bizarre because normally what a forensic scientist does when they take a swab, they do a presumptive test for blood. So, and Cohen admitted this in trial, they do a presumptive test for blood to see whether there's going to be any cells on the swab where you can isolate DNA from. But clearly here, she didn't do a presumptive DNA test or a test for blood, sorry. She just went ahead and isolated DNA from the swab. And lo and behold, from the swab, she gets or obtains the full genomic profile of Stephen Avery. And that was very, very damning, right? And so when one considers this, if we go slightly back to slide number 10, this is very important because Kathleen Zellner was actually able to get access to the swab, the hood latch swab. And what the DNA expert, Wright, was able to do is that in their laboratory, they've got a biochemistry test that can test for blood, saliva, semen, and urine. Now, when the fluid from the hood latch swab was tested, it tested negative for blood, saliva, and obviously semen and urine. So the question is, where did that DNA actually come from? So if we proceed to slide number 12, the suspicion is this: did the actual hood latch DNA come from a buccal swab? Now, it obviously can't be from the cheek, right? Because normally you would have detected saliva. Now, what is controversial, of course, when Stephen Avery was arrested, he was taken into a medical center. They did swabbing. They checked his body for cut marks, etc., etc. But what they also did was they did 2 groin swabs, right? And allegedly, when they looked at the search warrant, they weren't permitted to do groin swabs. According to Wiegert, they apparently threw away the groin swabs. Now, a groin swab is going to get skin cells on it, right? So if you get skin cells from the groin swab, it's going to be a rich source of DNA, exactly what you find from the hood latch. So it is very, very suspicious that the hood latch DNA could in fact have come from the groin swab, right? And because Cherie Cohen controls all the swabs, you never know what could have happened. You could have easily switched the sample around, but it is highly suspicious when you think about it, because Stephen Avery allegedly was meant to be actively bleeding. Yet, no blood was found on the hood latch, no blood was found underneath the hood, and no blood was examined on the hood latch swab. So that's very, very suspicious in itself. So guys, let's have a look at slide number 13. Well, Ken Kratz, he was questioned about this by a journalist. And he basically said to Ken Kratz, well, look, if Stephen Avery is going underneath the hood to disconnect the battery, where indeed are the fingerprints? And Ken Kratz, of course, didn't have an answer. He basically said, look, they were there looking for DNA. And the journalist persisted and said, well, you know, didn't they find any fingerprints? Right? Which normally you would find fingerprints if you're touching various parts underneath the car, and especially if you're disconnecting the battery cable. Oh, well, Ken Kratz was rather embarrassed and flustered by this, and he responded to the journalist, I don't have the case files. So he basically didn't want to comment any further. So guys, as you can see here, the crime scene, the Toyota RAV4, looks very, very suspicious. And that's why Kathleen Zellner wants to get her hands on the Toyota RAV4 so her forensics team can swab it from top to bottom. However, the problem is, because the RAV4 potentially has been sitting in storage for many, many years, there may be very little DNA left. But still, it's definitely worth trying and swabbing and looking for prints, etc., etc. Okay, guys, let's move to slide number 14. Well, a lot of changes has taken place since Stephen Avery was convicted. And as you can see here, the Assistant Attorney General, Tom Fallon, he still remains a special prosecutor in the Avery case. Now, remember, we're talking about when MAM 2 was released. Special Prosecutor Ken Kratz, well, we all know what happened to him with the sexting scandal. He actually resigned in 2010, but he's still very, very active in the case. But recently, both him and his wife have deleted their tweeting accounts, their tweet accounts, which is very, very interesting. Norm Garn, he had retired in 2015, but now he's been reappointed as a special prosecutor in the Stephen Avery case. And finally, the original judge, Patrick Willis, he retired in 2012. So if we have a look at slide number 15. So Zellner's approach to vacating Stephen Avery's conviction is what she wants to do using her team of experts is to undermine the confidence in the verdict. And the way she's going to do this is threefold. She's going to discover new evidence, of course, forensic evidence. She's going to look for Brady violations and also ineffective assistance of counsel. So this all comes packaged together as a post-conviction petition. And we know that Kathleen Zellner has filed many of these petitions. And at that time, Judge Sukowitz was the presiding judge. And we now know, of course, fast forwarding to 2020, that the state hopefully will give a response to Kathleen Zellner's latest findings. So Kathleen Zellner is focused very much on three areas of the case, mainly the forensic evidence, Brady violations, ineffective assistance to counsel. I think her last filing was, 151 pages. It's enormous. All right, guys. Now we're going to go to slide 16. So we're now changing tack. Now, I want to say right up front, guys, I'm not an expert on the search dogs. I know a little bit about them, but clearly there are individuals, and I could name McGilla. I forgot the other part of his name, but McGilla has done superb research on the search dogs that were used at the Avery Salvage Yard. Now, what I want to do is talk about the importance of the search dogs. Now, clearly, when the Toyota RAV4 was found at the Avery Salvage Yard by Pam of God and her daughter Nicole, search dogs were called onto the Avery Salvage Yard. One of the dogs was called Brutus, Canine Brutus, and Brutus was a Belgian Shepherd. Now, Brutus is trained to detect human remains, and also Brutus was trained to detect human cremains as well, right? Now, please note, Brutus was not specific for finding Teresa Halbach. Brutus will react to any human remains and cremains, right? That's important. So Brutus itself, the dog, was a human remains and cremains detection dog. The important thing to realize here, guys, is that Brutus was not centered for Teresa Halbach. So essentially, when Brutus was going around the Avery Salvage Yard, if Brutus detected the presence of blood or human tissue, the dog would alert to the dog handler. And the dog handler of Brutus was both Julie and Bob Kramer. And of course, once Brutus went around the salvage yard, a report was written, and we can get access to that report. So let's have a look at slide number 17. Now, this is a very, very interesting slide indeed. So Kathleen Zellner made the comment. Now, notice this particular dog track is not from Brutus, but from a dog called Loof. And Loof is a scent dog. Loof follows the scent of Teresa Halbach. So what the dog handler does is the dog handler will give Loof an item from Teresa Halbach, and I believe in this case it was from her shoe, a part of her shoe, sole of her shoe. So what they do, what the dog handler does, is pre-scent the dog. They let the dog loose and they follow where the dog goes. The important thing is the scent dog, and this is very, very telling, the dog went over the west-east berm and went into the quarry, right? And if you could have a look here, the scent dog doesn't hang around the Avery Salvage Yard. It actually goes into the adjacent quarry, the southern quarry. And that's very interesting because the dog did a big loop and came back to where the Toyota RAV4 was found. Now, of course, in the back of the Toyota RAV4, we have Teresa Halbach's blood. In the front of the Toyota RAV4, we have Stephen Avery's blood. But remember, the dog is scented specifically for Teresa Halbach's scent. Okay, so that was a very important finding where Loof, the scent dog, actually went. If we have a look at slide number 18, we can see the picture of Loof, the scent dog. Now, this particular track was very, very telling. So, what we can see here, the scent dog commenced at Cuss Road. It went along a dirt track. It went around the deer camp. Now, remember, the dog is looking for Teresa Halbach's scent. When the scent is strong, the dog would bark, alerting the dog handler. So the dog handler will take note of where the scent is strong. But if you have a look, the dog, Loof, who's a bloodhound, follows this trail, goes into the forest area, comes out of that area, and lo and behold, tracks down Conveyor Road and eventually goes to where the Toyota RAV4 was found. So you can see that that loof is spending a lot of its time in the quarry, right? And that's very important. And this made this made Kathleen Zellner ask the question in regards to Teresa Halbach, and I quote, "What in the world is she doing over there?" Now remember, the state's case is very simple, and that is that Teresa Halbach and her Toyota RAV4 never left the Average salvage yard. But lo and behold, we have Loof, the scent dog, who's spending the majority of its time off the salvage yard. And that's very, very telling. So if we have a look at slide number 19, we can see a summary of all the dog tracks. And again, guys, I'm not an expert in all the dog tracks. A lot of other YouTubers, excellent YouTubers, including McGilla, have done a lot of research and analysis regards to the dog tracks. But guys, what is obvious here? If you look at the dog tracks, the thing that strikes you is that the majority of the dog tracks are not on the Avery salvage yard. The dogs are spending the majority of their time off the salvage yard. And in a lot of cases, they're spending their time searching around the quarries, the surrounding quarries, right? And that's very, very telling in itself. So guys, if we have a look at slide number 20, we know that Pam of God found the Toyota RAV4 with her daughter on November the 5th, and we can see some images of it here. So Kathleen Zellner asked the obvious question. Well, what is the quickest way to place the Toyota RAV4 where it was found? And as you note here, guys, there is a berm very, very close, a west-east berm, very, very close to where the Toyota RAV4 was found. So if we have a look at slide number 21, we can see that from the quarry, from the location of the quarry, one of the quickest ways to drive the Toyota RAV4 is down Conveyor Road. And you can see it here as a yellow dot. So what Kathleen Zellner did was show a potential place where the Toyota RAV4 could have come from. So slide 21 shows the Toyota RAV4 on Conveyor Road. If we have a look at slide number 22, we can see that the Toyota RAV4 makes this alleged journey all the way down Conveyor Road. It then makes a right-hand turn. Let's have a look at slide 23. We can go through these very quickly. And so the Toyota RAV4 goes down this dirt track from Conveyor Road and approaching the berm. And finally, if we have a look at slide 24, we can see where the Toyota RAV4 was found. So by following this route, the Toyota RAV4 can easily come upon the Avery salvage yard and be dumped near the pit. So that's very, very important. The RAV4 isn't coming from the salvage yard, it's actually coming from the quarry. That's very, very important. And if you notice, think about this, guys. Why would Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey, according to the state, why would they leave the RAV4 right there out in the open in the pit from Conveyor Road? If that's where the RAV4 came from, they could have easily hid the RAV4 deep within the auto salvage yard, right? But they didn't. And what you find is the Toyota RAV4 is around the perimeter. And apparently, also the number plates that were found in a station wagon were also present around the perimeter. So the good thing about placing these objects around the perimeter is they're going to be very easily to find, right? Which is rather bizarre if you've committed this horrendous crime and you want to hide evidence. Well, the evidence here, guys, was right out in the open. Okay, so guys, let's have a look at slide 25. We're nearly finished. All right. Now, when Kathleen Zellner spoke to the Avery family, she discovered that the Averys use specific vehicles to block the conveyor road exit. Obviously, they've had trouble in the past of people coming in from the conveyor road and coming onto the salvage yard and stealing car parts, right? So what they did is that they blocked that exit to conveyor road. And one of the vehicles was a Pinto, a brown colored Pinto. So guys, let's have a look at slide 26. Now, what Kathleen Zellner noted and her team was that there was damage found to the front of the Pinto. And the Pinto is a brown color. So around the hood, around the bumper bar, the vehicle appeared to be damaged, as though some type of vehicle had run into it. Now, there's one important piece of information that Zellner found out. When she spoke with Earl Avery said, oh, that car, it was just a shell. There was no motor, there was no transmission, there was no floor, so it was just a car body. The thing about that is that the car itself would be relatively light, right? So it could be fairly easy to push aside that vehicle if the Toyota RAV4 had come down Conveyor Road. Well, let's have a look at slide 27. Lo and behold, what do we find? In the back of the Toyota RAV4, we find the blinker light, because we know that the Toyota RAV4 had sustained a front end damage to the right hand side blinker if you're looking at the Toyota RAV4 from the front. The blinker light was missing. Well, someone obviously had picked it up and they placed it in the back of the RAV, right? So if you have a look at the blinker light, unless I'm colorblind, you can see a brown stain mark or a discoloration on top of the light. Now, Ryan Hilliges, he was questioned regarding the light, and he said, "Oh yeah, the light that damage was done by Teresa Horbach, and she put in an application for an insurance claim. Yeah, nothing nefarious. It was done by her," which is very, very interesting because we have the RAV4 light with the color mark on it, a stain. Now, from my understanding, everyone who saw the Toyota RAV4 before November the 5th, no one had noted damage to the front. In fact, I think Stephen Avery said that the car looked like new, that it was in new condition. And think about it. If you work for the Auto Trader magazine and you're taking photographs of vehicles, it's not going to look very good on a professional level that your car is damaged, and especially a blinker light, the police are going to pull you over. All right, so if we have a look at slide 28, we can see that the bumper bar has hit something. There are extensive cracks in it, but note, there's a cable which connects to the blinker light. If you look inside the cavity of that bumper, it looks fairly clean, right? It doesn't appear to be any dirt, dust, mud, whatever. That tends to indicate that the damage occurred relatively recent. Otherwise, you would get road grime and everything else going inside that cavity. So that's a clue. Now, normally with the blinker light, it's held together by a cable. It's quite possible that whoever was driving the RAV4 hit something and the blinker fell out, and whoever was driving the RAV4 likely got out or did get out and pick up the blinker light and put it in the back. Now think about it. If you're driving the RAV4 from the quarry and you hit something and you leave a blinker light, well, that's going to be indicative that the Toyota RAV4 didn't come from within the salvage yard. You want to basically hide your tracks. So Kathleen Zellner surmised, okay, the damage we see to the RAV4 is because it hit the Pinto bumper to bumper to move it out the way. And hence the Toyota RAV4 was able to get onto the salvage yard. Well, what I did, if we have a look at slide 29, what I did is I compared the blinker light that we see in the back of the RAV4. Well, lo and behold, CASO released, there were a lot of new photographs that were recently released. I think they were from last year. And they show photos of the blinker light. Well, lo and behold, the brown stain has magically disappeared. If you compare both blinker lights, you can see that the CASO 2019 photo, there is no brown stain. Now, don't forget that Kathleen Zellner wants to get her hands on the blinker light. So far, the state has not given the blinker light to Kathleen Zellner. Quite clearly, if the Toyota RAV4 hit the Pinto, there will be paint. Forensically, you can determine where that paint had come from. You can do color matching and you can determine whether it actually hit another vehicle. But you can see from the photograph, there is no brown stain. It's clean. If you look at a photograph taken or done in the CASO 2017 report, even though it's black and white, you can see it's been cleaned up. There is no longer any stain on that blinker light. Now, if that's the case, that's evidence tampering. You're trying to hide something. So that's nefarious in itself. Okay, guys, let's have a look at slide 30. Now, this is some of my own research that I've done. And the reason why I'm including this here is because it's going to highlight something very, very important in regards to the dog tracks. Now, we know that, and I'll be finished very soon, guys, my apologies. Stephen Avery was interrogated on November the 9th, 2005 by Fassbender and Uyghur. And it was a very, very aggressive interrogation, especially after Stephen Avery had made the suggestion that the evidence in the Toyota RAV4 and the RAV4 itself was planted, right? Fassbender and Uyghur got very, very hostile with Stephen Avery. But I want you to note this. Now, remember, this is pre-Brendan Dassey. Fassbender and Uyghur knew nothing about Brendan Dassey. And during the interrogation, Fassbender told Stephen Avery something very, very important. And I quote, "We even figured out how you drove the truck. You drove across the field." Now notice that's that red arrow. There was a cornfield that ran from Cuss Road to the Stephen Avery's trailer. So there was a dirt track that ran across that cornfield. So I quote, "You drove across the field. You went by the dead end. The dead end is Cuss Road. You went down the dirt track or the dirt road by the hunting shacks. That's the deer camp. Because at the deer camp, there were stands for hunting deer. And I quote, "You went back, you went in that back entrance and you parked that car and walked out." Now note the following. "Bloodhound followed your scent all that way." Now, of course, the scent dog didn't have Stephen Avery's scent. The scent dog had Teresa Hallbach's scent. But, of course, investigators are permitted to lie, right? So the whole purpose there is to confuse Stephen and say, "Hey, look, we've got all the evidence." But, guys, this was critical because Fassbender and Uyghur knew where that Toyota RAV4 had come from. It had come from the quarry. It had driven down from Cuss Road, the deer camp, into the quarry, and lo and behold, you can see Loof followed it all the way to where the Toyota RAV4 was found. So the investigators knew where that Toyota RAV4 had come from. Well, now if we go to the next slide, we know something very important here, and that is Brendan Dassey inserted himself into the narrative. And of course, he was then extensively questioned by Fassbender and Wiegert. And I want you to note this. Brendan Dassey was questioned about the RAV4, and this is critical. And I quote, this is from his interrogation that was done on March the 1st. I quote, Wiegert, after she's in the fire, what do you guys do next? Brendan, go take the Jeep down in the pit. Fassbender, tell us how. Brendan, he drove it down there. And Fassbender, were you in the Jeep with him? Brendan nods, yes, Fassbender, okay, tell us how you got down there. Now remember, guys, Fassbender and Wiegert already know where the Toyota RAV4 came from. It came from the quarry, right? Brendan, he drove. Fassbender, truthfully, Brendan, he drove down there and he put it back by the trees and covered it with branches and a hood. Now, guys, before you all jump up and down, all of that information was common knowledge. It was in the media, it was in newspapers, it was on TV. Fassbender, how did you get it down there? What route did you take? Brendan, past Chucky's house. Whoa, jaw on the ground. And I'll tell you why. So when you think about this, guys, if this is true, that means that the Toyota RAV4 was in the pit area from the evening of Monday, the 31st of October, to Saturday mid-morning, November the 5th. So that Toyota RAV4 was sitting in the pit area and no one had noticed it there, including Earl. I believe Stephen was down there, Robert, Fabian, I think. They were down there sighting in their rifles on a golf cart, I think, because Earl Avery also uprooted some trees as well. No one had noticed a Toyota RAV4 down there. And think about it, guys. The car was relatively new, and we know that the Toyota RAV4 was placed in an area of all rusted out cars. So in other words, it would have stood out. Okay, so why is that important, guys? Well, let's have a look at the next slide. So what the state actually did is they mapped out the location of the Toyota RAV4, and according to what Brendan said. And so you can see here, guys, that if what Brendan said is correct, then the Toyota RAV4 had to have gone past his mother's house, his grandmother's house, Dolores's house, past Chucky Avery's house, and down to the pit area. And there's one problem. If you look at all the dog tracks that were found, none of the dog tracks go down that area. All the dog tracks are in the salvage, are not on the salvage yard, but are in the quarry. Therefore, the dog tracks point to the Toyota RAV4 actually coming from the quarry area. Exactly what Fassbender said to Stephen on November the 9th. What is disingenuous here is that clearly Brendan Dassey had no idea where that Toyota RAV4 had come from. And his version of events is at odds with the dogs, because the dog tracks are predominantly off the Avery salvage yard and not near or around the route where Brendan Dassey said. And this goes to show one important thing. the investigators must have known that Brendan Dassey had no idea what had occurred, yet they simply bypassed that. So, guys, a final slide. And note, Kathleen Zellner said, if someone is innocent, you will find a way. And this is remarkable that Brendan Dassey got one of the most important aspects of this case completely wrong. And that is, he completely got the route of the Toyota RAV4 completely wrong. If Brendan Dassey had said, oh yeah, we drove it exactly the route that Loof went, then you know that something is corroborated. And this is another piece of forensic evidence that is not corroborated by what actually took place. So those dog tracks, and Kathleen Zellner used them to great advantage. Now, of course, in court, if she gets in front of a judge, that's precisely what she's going to hit them with, because she's come up with a scenario of where Teresa Horbach likely was murdered. And it wasn't on the Avery salvage yard. All right, guys, we made it. Hopefully nobody got a coronavirus infection. Guys, let's open it up to the panel and the questions. Let's go for it, guys. Who's got a question? Who's got a comment? Oh, one strand.
Yes, Dr. Silkman. So going back to the beginning with the investigation was underway. They questioned Brendan. They suggested until he agreed with them that he went under the hood.
Correct.
At that time, Ken Kratz, I believe, had every intent of using him against Stephen and using his confession in the case. So first of all, when Ken Kratz, I've heard him subsequently afterwards say that this was a case that was circumstantial forensic science. That's what it was based on, because they didn't use Brendan's testimony. But for him to say to somebody who's interviewing him, number one, we weren't looking for prints, which we saw obviously that they did, and there weren't obviously any. But for him to say that they were looking for DNA,
correct,
instead of blood, and for them to find it on the only place that Brendan has then told them that it was, that just screams to me that they planted it. That just screams it. How about you?
Oh, there's no doubt. And I agree with what Kathleen Zellner surmised, that the state needed another fluid. So, Stephen Avery potentially could explain why his blood was in the Toyota RAV4, but it might be a little bit more tricky to explain what his so-called sweat DNA was doing underneath the hood. It basically put Stephen Avery underneath the hood of the Toyota RAV4. So this was actually seen as a very important piece of evidence against Stephen Avery. And that convinced Nancy Grace, right? Because remember, Nancy Grace was said, okay, what's your sweat DNA doing underneath the hood? You got to be guilty. But clearly, the DNA did not come from blood. It did not come from saliva. Now, think about it, guys. If Stephen Avery is actively bleeding, he needed to use his right hand to open up the hood latch. He also had to put his hand on the bar that holds the hood open, and he had to use his hands to disconnect the battery cable. Now, if the guilter says, oh, well, he used his left hand, oh, great. That means that Stephen Avery was conscious that he was bleeding. So if that's the case, if he was conscious that he was bleeding, he would have cleaned up, right? So it makes no sense at all. But Zellner's forensic expert, DNA expert, showed that the amount of DNA left on that hood latch is not consistent with touch DNA, right? Yes, when you touch an object, you leave your skin, but the amount of DNA left on that hood latch was enormous. So it's very suspicious.
The other thing is they supposedly took this body that had been shot, stabbed, jugular cut, and moved it into this RAV. Only got the blood of Teresa's along the side. Then, having walked through all this blood, got in the vehicle without getting blood anywhere from their shoes or their arms or anything in that car.
Correct.
And then Stephen cleaned it up, but didn't clean the drops
Correct.
up. That doesn't make much sense.
Correct. I mean, a lot of us have seen crime shows, and we've actually seen that, if you shoot someone that many times, especially in the head is a very rich source of blood. And they're moving and transporting, apparently, the body into the back of the RAV, which is crazy for a start because they're meant to put her in the fire pit. So you've got this crazy situation whereby they murder Teresa Halbach, shoot her 10 or 11 times, stab her, cut her, lift her up, put her in the back of the RAV, then, wait for it, change their mind, take her out of the RAV4 and bring her to the fire pit, right? So if you're walking through blood, if you're handling a victim that's been shot and actively bleeding, profusely bleeding, you're going to leave blood everywhere. And so if you look at the Toyota RAV4, it looks manufactured, right? It actually looks like it's been planted because it doesn't look like a normal crime scene, in my opinion. Nan's Life, do you have a question?
Yes, actually. And here we have Brendan saying, I was in the car. I drove with him. But
Yes.
There's absolutely no sign of Brendan anywhere while they're busy trying to find DNA.
Yes.
No sign. But however, I'd like to go back to this hood latch thing because people like Ken Kratz and Nancy Grace, who misinform continually. Nancy Grace, in January of 2019 on her podcast, she states, I can see him hunched over the steering wheel after he killed her, trying to hide the car and getting sweat DNA in the car.
Yes,
it's this kind of information that is spread by the individuals who have a platform to inform the followers of facts, yet continually mislead them with ignorant opinions. My thought.
Correct. And if we have a look, remember in podcast number 1, and also when we looked at Man 1 as well, look, if you're attesting that Stephen Avery had left touch DNA underneath the hood, on the hood latch, then he would have touch DNA everywhere in that vehicle, right? And so Zellner's experts did a reproduction whereby they had someone who had an actively bleeding finger attempt to drive the vehicle or, touch the normal things you would do when you drive a car. If you look at the Toyota RAV4, blood is not present in any of those locations. Now, please, don't try and tell me that Cherie Cohane didn't think, well, okay, yeah, I didn't note any blood, but I'm going to swab it anyway, right? So why didn't she swab the gear shift lever? Why didn't she swab in half a dozen other places just to do a touch DNA profile, right?
Right, and nothing was done because it wouldn't be there.
No, and you know what's very damning? Sorry, guys, I know there's lots of questions and we'll get to them. What's very damning is that there's a lot of look, we'll take a question. Otherwise, I'm going to rant on for half an hour. Lily, do you have a question?
Well, T1 would like to know, could the amount of DNA found on the hood latch come from Stephen sucking on his wounded finger? He says he did that during the November 9th interview, and we're kind of creatures of habit, maybe?
Yeah.
But could that pass on something?
No, because what the DNA expert, thank you, T1, for that question. What the DNA expert did was actually test for the presence of blood and also for the presence of saliva. Now, these are very sensitive biochemical tests. They look for biomarkers. So even though you can't see blood, it'll detect blood protein. Even you obviously can't see the saliva, but it will detect for a specific enzyme that's present in saliva. It came up negative. So therefore, the DNA that's present on the hood latch did not come from a blood source. It did not come from saliva. Thank you, Lily. Sammy, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the YouTube chat. Glenn had mentioned on average there are 5 skin cells left behind per fingerprint. After 2 weeks, the chances of getting a full DNA profile drops to 27%. If it was touch DNA, then there shouldn't be an extractable profile. And
Oh, yes.
yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that question. Yeah. See, the thing is this. Stephen Avery, just say he did touch the hood latch. Nearly 150 days went by. So therefore, if all that time period had gone by, you would expect the amount of DNA that you would extract would be extremely, extremely low, right? Now, think about it. When you touch your hood latch to open up the hood, you might spend, what, a second, half a second, flicking the hood latch? That's it. So obviously, if you keep on touching the hood latch, you leave more and more touch DNA behind. But if remember, he's a car mechanic. He works with cars. To flick the hood latch would have taken him under a second. So he's not going to repeatedly touch the hood latch. But what is damning was that no blood, no saliva was detected on that swab. And that the thing is, sorry guys, what was damning was that Cherie Culhane admitted, she was asked this, okay, so how do you detect DNA? How would you do a DNA test when you're doing a swab? She said, first of all, I look for a stain. I look for blood. I then do a presumptive test for blood. If it comes up negative, that's it. I don't sample it. If it comes up positive, I then sample it and do a DNA extraction. Well, guess what? She noted no blood on the hood latch and no blood on the key. So she broke her own protocol and still extracted DNA from those samples. Wow, that's amazing.
Tracy also asked, would gloves wipe off some of the DNA when the crime lab opened the hood latch?
Correct. So if you've got skin cells present on the hood latch, if you put on rubber gloves and you open up the hood latch, yes, if you touch the same part, you'll potentially transfer the DNA or the skin cells which are on the hood latch onto your own rubber glove. And it can go the other way. If the guy that opened up the hood latch was in the Toyota RAV4, he could have got a contaminating source on his glove and put it on the hood latch. So it can actually go either way. Neverly, do you have a comment or question?
Yes, in regards to the hood latch, by the way, killer presentation, Dr. Silkman.
Thank you.
You're welcome. In regards to the hood latch, isn't that like I've never opened one myself, so forgive me for being ignorant. But it's a sincere question. Isn't that a metal part very smooth? And if
Yes,
you're
it is.
sweaty, wouldn't that be kind of wiping it off right away?
Well, yes, I understand your question, and it's difficult. You need to do controlled experiments. So basically, what the DNA expert really needed to do, Neverly, was to get someone who was sweating. So you do an experiment whereby someone is not sweating and someone who is sweating and compare the amount of DNA that you get back. Also, you want to get people with different finger, their structure on their fingers, people with calluses, someone who's worked with cars, someone who's got almost identical fingers to Stephen Avery, and try it. But Overall, though, one can clearly see that Stephen Avery left a huge amount of DNA on that hood latch, and it's inconsistent with what you would normally expect with touch DNA. With touch DNA, guys, you leave a very, very small amount of DNA, a fingerprint's worth, and that's very, very tiny.
And
Yes, Neville. Yes.
Interestingly enough, in that test that Kathleen Zellner did, that Judge Angela poo-pooed on, never mind, there was this enormous amount of Stephen's DNA, correct?
Correct.
Same on the key.
Correct.
Nice.
Correct. And the other thing, of course, is that with the key can't be tested again. All the DNA has been used up on the key. And furthermore, there's no mixed profile. Now, guys, think about it. Teresa Halbach probably touched the hood latch herself. Anybody that's in a service station could have touched the hood latch themselves as well. And underneath, you got it, your car right now, open up the hood, it's dirty, it's dusty, it's greasy, unless you've got a totally brand new vehicle. You'd expect to find oil, grit, etc., etc. The swab that was obtained, yes, it was discolored, but boy, it wasn't what you would normally find with a hood latch. Normally, it would be fairly dirty. Jack?
Just a quick comment, and this talking about damming, just going back to Brendan and Stephen allegedly doing all this killing and stabbing and shooting, and this alleged area in the garage that had this blood that they said that they cleaned up. Wouldn't you think that their shoes, and looking at both of their shoes, we have photographs of them, that there would be blood, something up in the cracks of those shoes? I know that in different cases, blood has been found, and as far as I know, those were never tested. Pretty damning, in my opinion, that they didn't look. I mean, come on, they worked through all this blood and they didn't look at it.
Correct. Yeah, and also when you look at the Toyota RAV4, there's obviously no signs of footprints on the carpet, right, or blood. So there's no transference of Teresa's blood or the victim's blood in the front seats of the Toyota RAV4. And what's damning, guys, is that apparently Brendan said he drove with Stephen in the Toyota RAV4. Well, we can see that on the passenger seat, there is a black CD case that's got blood on it and a bottle of water. So if that's the case, did Brendan actually sit on blood? And if that's the case, why isn't there any blood on his jeans? So the whole scenario does not make any sense at all.
Just to follow that up, I mean, if they walked through all this blood, there would have been footprints of blood that there's no way they could have found all that. And plus, it would have likely been deposited in the RAV from their shoes.
Correct. So, when one looks at the crime scene, it doesn't make any sense. When you look at the Toyota RAV4, it honestly looks too clean for a savage, brutal murder that took place. It doesn't look right. And when you think about blood, the microspray of blood, it would be impossible to see, impossible to detect. Yet the crime scene investigators used luminol. They didn't find anything. One Strand, do you have a question?
Yes, Dr. Silkman. So going to the placement of the RAV, I have listened to Stephen's calls with Jody, and on the day it was found, he's like, "I'm not that stupid. I would never, to have it, to leave it on it properly like that if I would have done something like this." So, basically, Wiegert and Fackbender suspect that he took it out there on the 31st while the property was open for business.
Yes.
And left it there, not knowing when she was going to be reported missing, and then left it there again when he knew that it was on the news and there were posters and they had customers going back and forth.
Correct. And don't forget, he allegedly drove the vehicle right past the crusher. Right. And, and it's incredible that Fassbender and we get said to Stephen during the interrogation on November the 9th, oh, you were going to crush it, but you didn't have any time. And Stephen Avery's going, what the hell? So the investigators are telling Stephen what he was going to do, right? And quite clearly, when you see the dog tracks are very damning because they don't support Brendan's version of events, right? They don't support a Toyota RAV4 with fresh blood in it having been driven along that perimeter. But it does support the Toyota RAV4 coming from the back way, exactly what Fassbender told Stephen Avery. So that's very, very damning. So in other words, go ahead.
So that would be, I mean, most likely, why would Stephen, if it were him, drive it all the way around and come back up Cuss Road? That doesn't make sense. So that leans towards somebody else planting it, correct?
No doubt. And think about this, guys. Why would Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey drive the Toyota RAV4 off the salvage yard only to bring it back onto the salvage yard, the place where he works? Has anyone got an answer to that one?
He could have easily left that thing in the quarry, taking a couple of 5-gallon buckets of kerosene and a road flare, end of wrap.
Correct.
Done. It's over. Down to the.
Right. And even with Wiegert and
Correct.
Fassbender saying, oh, you were going to crush it, but you ran out of time. Well, they were listening to all of his phone calls, so they would have heard him say that to Jody.
Correct. And not only that, even if he had crushed the vehicle, the rescue team opened up all the crushed cars. And
Well,
furthermore, go ahead.
Why would he drive it up the back to put it 10 minutes from the front?
Yeah, that's correct. Correct. It makes no sense. If you're going to take the vehicle off the property, you put it in a concealed location. You do what Jack said. You load it up with petrol and you burn it. There goes all your forensic evidence. Bang, gone. By the time the fire brigade gets to it, there'll be nothing left but an empty shell. So to drive the vehicle off the property only to bring it back onto the property is crazy. And when you think about it, right, it was him and his brothers that put the vehicles at the end of Conveyor Road to block it. So he knew that he had to go past these vehicles. And the whole scenario does not make any sense at all. And so, but the dog tracks actually confirm the suspicions that Fassbender told Stephen that you brought the vehicle from the back entrance. Lo and behold, when they question Brendan, he goes on, we drove around the perimeter. So you can see that Brendan Dassey clearly had no idea what had happened to that Toyota RAV4. That's another piece of evidence that was not corroborated. Lily, do you have a comment?
Yeah, Shane wants to know the dogs. Are they able to pick up a scent if the body's been in a car, or does the body have to be, on foot?
Well, again, look, I'm not an expert on the dogs. And I have to admit that straight up front. But when they took Brutus around the Avery salvage yard, Brutus went to the back tire of the Toyota RAV4 and barked. So Brutus wanted to get inside the Toyota RAV4, but they didn't allow him, right? So note, Brutus detects human remains. So Brutus was able to smell or detect the blood that was in the back of the Toyota RAV4, because Brutus actually went in the back wheel and barked, right? So the blood obviously was off the ground. So
Right.
Brutus was able to detect the presence of that blood.
Yeah.
Right? but also Brutus was able to, now note, do a hit in Stephen Avery's bathroom because there was blood on the ground. And also Brutus was able to do a hit, I think it was on Chuck Avery's house as well. So remember, Brutus does not detect Teresa Halbach necessarily. Brutus would detect, they often refer to dogs like that as being a cadaver dog, but they detect human remains. So, in other words, if you leave blood on the ground, the blood obviously decays. If there's tissue, organs, or whatever, the dog would detect that. Whoever it belongs to, the dog's got no idea.
Right.
So, yes, Brutus
and
was able to detect the blood in the Rav.
Okay. Well, yeah, blood in the Rav, but I'm thinking what he's asking is, say they took Teresa in the Rav, they drove her from point A to B with her not touching the ground. Would the dog be able to smell that out?
Well, I think the giveaway is what Loof found, right? And Loof is a scent dog. And if you have a look, Loof, I don't think Loof was the only scent dog. But the fact that Loof went around the cornfield, that access road, if you believe that Teresa Halbach was in that vehicle or the vehicle was driven off the Avery salvage yard, then Loof followed that scent. So Loof follows the scent of Teresa Halbach. So something weird is going on with those dog tracks. Because if Teresa, put it this way, if Teresa Halbach never left the Avery salvage yard, what's her scent doing anywhere off the salvage yard? That's the kicker. And not only that, Loof went to where the Toyota RAV4 was. So made all its way around the Cuss Road, Deer Camp, the cornfield, but a conveyor rope, but eventually went to where the RAV4 was, right?
Okay.
So the dog is following the scent.
Yeah.
So don't forget, parts of Teresa Halbach could be brought back to the salvage yard. That may explain the back and forth movement of the scent dogs.
Exactly.
So it's very, very incriminating.
Well, just another little thing about the dogs, where the guys brought Teresa from the trailer to the garage, there would have been blood dripping everywhere there. Did the dogs hit on that area at all?
Well, where the fire pit was, now wait for it, Brutus and I believe Loof did not have access to that area because Bear was there. Now, this is completely crazy because when one thinks about it, if you're going to bring in search dogs, you want to make sure there's no other animals present that could potentially disrupt the search. So the investigators left Bear there for I don't know how many days, and the dog handlers actually complained that they needed to remove Bear. So what happened was, I think it was Brutus, I'm not sure about Loof, but they barked because they saw Bear. So you don't know whether that's an alert or the fact that they were reacting to the presence of Bear. So before you use the search dogs, you want to make sure you take Bear out, right? Remove him. And there are dog handlers that could have easily called a professional dog handler to remove Bear safely, but they didn't, which means that the bones, the alleged bones in the burn pit, weren't discovered to the 8th. And so Ken Kratz used that as an excuse as to why the bones were not detected earlier, which I think which is really ridiculous when you think about it. So yes. Now remember, Brutus is only going to detect blood organs, tissue. Brutus is not specific for Teresa Hallbach. So, Stephen Avery admitted he was bleeding everywhere. So
Right.
he could have really picked up Stephen Avery's blood. We don't know.
Glenn McLean asked us a question.
Yes,
Maybe
Nemily.
if we already addressed this, forgive me, I got distracted a little bit. Does somebody have to have walked with Teresa's bones from Cuss Road to leave a trail for the cadaver dogs? Was the dog following a trail, or could it smell remains at Cuss Road from the gravel pit?
That's a very good question. Now, Brutus is there. Brutus can detect human remains and cremains. The dog was actually trained to pick up cremains, but it really is dependent. Like, for example, Loof went really crazy around the burial site, right? The alleged burial site at Cuss Road. The burial site was roped off with the police crime scene tape. The handler wanted to bring the dog under the tape and search around the area. I believe it was Sheriff Pagel who denied them from doing so. So the dog wasn't permitted to go and search around that burial site. Why? If you bring in, if you're using a cadaver dog, and if you're using a scent dog, don't you want to check everywhere? So they prevented, I believe it was Loof, from checking where the burial site was.
Another question
yes,
Naz
Nemily.
asked, actually. No, let me see. Sorry. Okay, somebody else go. I can't find it.
Just to comment about the scent dogs and that kind of thing. McGilla found a really good bit of information that other people had done about these scent dogs. Is that if we think about, and I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but these scent dogs, the contamination that could happen, this leads off into other areas as well, but just think about someone that may have been in Teresa's house.
I know exactly where you're going with this,
right?
Right.
So
I know exactly where you're going.
So if we have people that per se have been, kind of moved into Teresa's house or, that kind of thing, and they found themselves in the quarry doing whatever nefarious deeds and walking around making these trips back and forth from that area to Stephen's fire pit. This is what I'm saying. So these dogs, apparently, I had no idea the sensitivity of how they can detect, and it's crazy until I read it. And McGilla has really found a really interesting aspect. That was really just a comment, and it poses a lot of questions for me.
It certainly does, and I think one's got to be a little bit cautious about not over interpreting the dog tracks. But what was interesting is I read the report regarding the dog tracks, and they stated, the person who wrote the report stated that both the cadaver dog and the scent dog found common hits in the quarry. That's very damning.
I think that's key. I think that's extremely damning.
No question. You can see where the tracks, if you look at slide 19, you can see where the tracks intersect, right? Where there are hot spots where the dogs tend to spend a lot of time at. And clearly someone went back and forth on the cornfield between Cuss Road and Stephen Avery's trailer, because the dogs are going up and down. Furthermore, there are regions on the berms which are hotspots. right? So why are the dogs anywhere near the berms in the first place? Is it because someone who dumped the Toyota RAV4 went out that particular way? We don't know. But something crazy is going on. One would have expected, guys, that if Teresa Horbach and her Toyota RAV4 never left the Avery salvage yard, one would have expected there to be a concentration of dog tracks on the salvage yard. What you find is the opposite. The majority of those tracks are off the salvage yard. They concentrate on the surrounding quarries, but there is a very damning track too that I see. One that goes back and forth between Cuss Road and the salvage yard where Stephen Avery's trailer is. That's a perfect place if you're going to plant electronics, if you're going to plant bones. That's the way you do it. You come in through the back entrance at night, no one's going to notice you. And remember, Stephen Avery saw lights. Remember? He saw lights. And it could well have been someone traveling back and forth across the cornfield. Nance Life, do you have a quick comment?
Well, just looking at that map with the tracks, it's also funny that we could see that ghostly image when we were looking at that one flyover video, and the tracks would be in that area as well.
Correct. Now, one's got to be, like I said, one's got to be cautious about not overinterpreting the dog tracks.
Right.
But to me, it's damning. The evidence is right there, and Zona was correct to ask the question: what on earth is Teresa Horbach doing there? Right? She was at the Avery salvage yard photographing a vehicle, and according to Stephen, she left. Right? All of a sudden, you see this preponderance of tracks in the quarry area, but you have an accumulation of tracks at Cuss, the burial site, and also the quarry. And can someone please take over? Can someone please take over the discussion?
Jax, you want to take over?
Yes, someone take over, please.
Yeah, sure, no problem, Dr. Silkman.
Sure. Let's get to some of the questions. Narrowly, I think you were on them. Have you found the place that you want to some comment questions?
Yeah, I'm looking through them.
Well, a lot of people were having a lot of conversation in the YouTube chat about the fact that, walking back and forth with a body anywhere, and that the scent dogs, what they picked up was closer to the other house than Stephen's. That was brought up also.
The other house meaning Chuck's?
Well, there was other buildings where the scent dogs had picked up scent and were told, "Oh, you can't go over there," as
Nothing
opposed
to
to
see?
Stephen's. Yeah.
Yeah, the Pagel ordered that.
But there's just a lot of chat about that and the sweat DNA. How could they get away with claiming that when there is no such a thing?
Yeah, because we have DNA in lots of it in blood and saliva, and then semen and urine, which was never came up. So where did that sweat come from? I don't know. It was from
Well,
cats.
I think what they're asking is, how on earth did they get away with claiming this in court as an argument for, his DNA being present? And in reality, there is no such a thing.
I think that we have to look at a little bit at the time frame of 2005, 6, 7, and the CSI effect. I know that everyone's kind of heard of that, and people, in juries, if they're a little bit unsophisticated and really don't know, they see these, and it's a real thing. They see something on TV and they believe it, and it's just not true at all. Getting a DNA result in 24 hours and getting these other test results in just like no time at all. It doesn't work like that. But unfortunately, the effect that these various drama shows had on people is insane, and I think juries are not immune to it. They want to see this DNA result. Even today, people are demanding DNA.
And quite possibly back then, the judge probably wasn't aware that wasn't such a thing.
And nobody disputed that, did they, at the time? So Kratz had a free reign of saying whatever he wanted, and conveniently, they had that swab that we're suspecting that was used on the hood latch, correct?
The groin.
So if no,
The groin
swab, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's where the sweat is, right?
And that's what
The person
everybody
is a-
else on this chat and YouTube is saying, that they believe that it actually was the groin swab that was used on the hood latch to create the illusion that he had left his DNA there.
Massive amount of DNA that should have never existed after.
That's right.
150, approximately 150 days. I mean, we're looking at 5 months. No way. I don't believe it. I know others may, but I just can't buy that. Even considering that it may, it was the RAV was apparently outside for approximately a week, allegedly, if you take the state's word for it, and then it gets moved to a controlled environment. Even still, there's a degradation, or however you pronounce it. The sample just won't last. Plus, how many people handled that latch between, let's just say, the 1st of November and when they tested that latch at the 1st of March?
Yeah, that came up too. Someone asked, how many times do you think they themselves had opened that, especially like when they discovered there's no battery and there it is still on the Avery salvage yard?
And we're talking even with the gloves, if they're opening that, closing, if they're touching it, they're just taking cells off.
That's right.
Not putting more on. They're just wiping it clean with gloves, because they're all rubbery and latex. They take stuff off.
But yet you get the super rich concentration. It's crazy.
Only if you're Stephen Avery, you get that. Yes.
It's impossible.
It is impossible. Yeah. And same with the key. Remember that? No Teresa's DNA whatsoever. However,
now, when that key came up, did Kathleen say that it looked like, from the different ways that they tried to do, repeat that and mimic that it was more as if a toothbrush had been scrubbed on top of it?
And wasn't his toothbrush missing?
I believe in the phone calls, it sounded like it was.
Jody said she found it under the kitchen sink and that it looked like it had been messed with.
Yeah.
That's a weird place to find it. But, if we think about all of that, but a massive piece of information, the dogs being all over, really, just to say, mainly away from the Avery salvage yard. And if we look at what was reported at the time, even Kratz said at trial, he's only going to spend 20 seconds on the bone of the quarry bones. They did everything possible to keep everything to quarry on the down low. No media reporting at all, none. And the cops were all over that area, beginning on November 7th.
Well, yeah, they pulled everybody off except one guy guarding the barrels off of Avery's to go over there at one point.
Yeah, I mean, Colburn and Link were called specifically to go over there. You don't move all those resources for nothing. You even as inept as they were, you don't do that unless they found something. So
more than
Sean
a stump.
Morani. Yeah, more than that. I have another question. Sean Moroni asked, if the RAV was locked at ASY, why was no one else's DNA recovered from the hood latch? Someone at ASY had to have opened the hood. Why no DNA? Exactly, right?
That's right.
Exactly.
Well, supposedly nobody else opened the hood on Avery's because They couldn't get inside the vehicle. First, you had to trip that one latch inside, and then you go open the outer hood latch.
So, in other words, they're claiming that nobody touched that car whatsoever. No fingerprints, no anybody's DNA. They weren't looking for that because Kratz didn't have his file in front of him,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
They never even found any of Teresa's fingerprints in there, right?
I know.
That's just,
That's
that
bad.
baffles me. That
That's
baffles
bad.
me.
That's really, really bad. Yeah.
Well, if you say that, Brad said that Stephen had he was an active bleeder. He gets in the RAV. There's no blood on the door handle. There's no blood on the steering wheel. There's no blood straight down from where the steering wheel would be, because he says he started the RAV, so there should have been blood if he was dripping. Should have been blood directly below that. There's none on the gear shifter or the console.
Yeah, just like they found it in his Grand Am. The blood was
Everywhere.
in all appropriate spaces.
Areas.
you
That's
would-
that's
yes, exactly.
that's right.
Yeah.
That leads
Bob,
to me. That so leads to me to believe that it was planted.
Mm-hmm.
The-
So we have fresh blood, we have light blood, dark blood, and flakes. So Stephen
Yeah,
was bleeding
yeah.
flakes. Yeah. Okay. Bob Bailey asks, who was at the hospital where DNA was originally taken and was in charge of disposing the groin swabs? And he also answered it. He says Wiegert was supposed to dispose of the swabs
Yes, that's right.
because the warrant didn't cover a groin swab anyway. Anyway.
Well, I would think that the nurse who took it should have been the one to dispose of it.
But
not
Stephen
Pratt.
even gave a statement. He said, I saw Wiegert reaching into the trash can and getting it out.
Well, they did. Sorry, guys.
Welcome back.
Welcome
Thank
back.
you. Case solved.
Of
Yes.
course.
Okay. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
While you were
Yeah.
away, the
Yeah.
case
Why?
is over.
Yeah, they're going to
Right
get
over.
arrest warrants now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, apparently 2 groin swabs were taken, but they weren't part of the original search warrant. So apparently, we get dispose of them in a Sharps container. I reckon he stuck them in his pocket. Yeah. All right, guys. Do we have any more? Oh, one
Dr.
strand.
Silkman, while you were gone, we were asking about the possibility of Stephen's toothbrush having been used on that hood latch or swabbed and used.
That would have gave saliva, though. Then there would have been saliva.
Correct. Maybe on the key, that's a possibility, but on the hood latch, they actually tested it for saliva and it came back negative. So it wasn't, very unlikely it was from a toothbrush. Yeah. It's got to be from a source that's rich in skin cells, right? And a groin swab would be.
Just one of the things that they were asking about with the dogs on McGilla has stated previously that some dogs are able to follow the scent of a slow moving vehicle.
Yes, I would imagine so. I mean, their sensitivity to scent is phenomenal. I don't know what the percentage is, but they are very, very sensitive to smell. And what the dog handler did was preload the scent dogs with, I think it was the inner sole of one of Teresa Horbach's shoes. So they actually keep that in a closed container to avoid contamination. They preload the scent dog with the scent, and then they close it up. So you don't want to be walking around the salvage yard with Teresa Horbach's scent. It's got to be in an enclosed container so you don't contaminate the scene.
I have a little fun fact when you're done.
Go for it, Lily. Go for it.
No, that was Sammy.
Oh, I was
Oh,
just
Sammy.
saying, I was just saying, one year I had gone to the vet, I had a dachshund, and for some reason, we were trying to figure out what kind of job this little dachshund would like to have, so we were asking the vet about scent dogs and things like that and what kind of training. And he said the bigger the dog with the larger, longer snout have better sensors in their nose for scenting. And so he
Yes.
said those dogs make better scent dogs for that very reason.
Correct. Obviously, the more sensors that you have in the nasal cavity, you're going to really pick up. I suppose you're going to be more sensitive to scents. But again, guys, I'm not an expert on the dogs. I've got to learn and read a lot more. But generally speaking, if you look at the maps, I think they're very damning. And the obvious question is, what are the dogs doing predominantly outside the salvage yard? Now, if we're saying that parts of Teresa's cremains, parts of her belongings were brought back to the salvage yard, well, I think the tracks actually point out a possible way that they came in, likely through the cornfield, the back cornfield. And in future episodes of the podcast, we'll actually have a look at photographs taken from Cuss Road, and they're very, very damning. You can see a straight line directly to Stephen Avery's property. And I believe Stephen, in an interview, used to state that Redont used to take that shortcut across the cornfield to get to the other side of the salvage yard. Yes. Lily, do you have a question?
Well, T asked this a while back, and we're just getting to it. But he asked, can swabs be tested and compared for origin? Not who they came from, but where did the swab come from?
Well, the only way you're going to really do that is look at microtrace elements. Like, for example, whether there's pollen, dirt, even probably bacteria. So that can be done. For example, if a particular pollen or some type of dirt is found in a particular location, i.e. the quarry, yeah.
That
It's
is
interesting.
something really serious to take into consideration for all of this.
Well,
Correct.
like I said in last week's podcast, in the 85 case, they grabbed his clothes and they checked for spores and pollen and any leaves and anything that coincided with the beach, and they never
Correct.
found any.
Correct.
But
I mean, have a look what Zellner's expert did with item FL. Right, by doing microtrace analysis, the analyst confirmed that there's no bone, but wood. So I mean, her experts will definitely look at everything very, very carefully and chemically to determine the potential origin of certain swabs. But also with the Toyota RAV4, you can check the wheels, you can check the sides of the vehicle for dirt, dust, see where it's been. Because according to Stephen, when he saw the Toyota RAV4, he said it was relatively clean and new looking. But if you look at the Toyota RAV4, it looks pretty well beaten up. Right? It's gone through somewhere that's fairly dirty. And of course, a quarry fits that bill perfectly. Neverly, do you have any questions?
Yes, the hood latch, the swab that they showed in the evidence that they swabbed the hood latch was also extremely clean. Like the Q-tip, the cotton part was very, very clean, which is unusual for the hood latch, right? Because who
For
opens
a
the
hood
hood
latch,
latches?
correct.
Yeah.
For a hood latch, correct, because it normally is quite greasy, and if you think about it, right? Sorry, BB.
Oh, not so much grease, more grime. It's more grime. You can
Right.
even get your fingers dirty when you go in there and trip
Correct.
one. I've
Correct.
tripped many on many different cars, and you usually have to squeeze your hand down in there and get to it and then trip it, and there's very little room
Yes.
in there to do it, but you'll quite frequently even get grime on your fingers when you do it.
Yes, and of course, the other thing, of course, is that when you open up a hood latch, you've got to flick a switch in the vehicle itself. There's a hood latch release. Believe it or not, I don't believe the investigator swabbed that. So if he's leaving touch DNA on the hood latch, he would obviously leave touch DNA on the lever. And remember, you've got to put a bit of force on it too. on the lever on the inside of the vehicle to pop the hood latch. So again, that's something the investigators didn't do, which is rather weird. Okay, guys, do we have any other questions? Jack?
Not really a question, just a comment and a thought, and maybe for discussion for later. But given what we know was manipulated and how everything's been misled, misdirected, just my
Yes.
feeling, looking at this for over 4 years, that Teresa was not killed on the 31st. It was sometime after, and obviously somewhere else. And where does that leave us? And where does that lead us, I guess, is the better question.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
just an opinion of mine. I'm not saying that there's anyone else, but I do not believe that she was killed on 31st of October, 2005.
Well, you know
I'm
what's
kind of with you
remarkable?
on that one, Jax.
Yes. Well, what's remarkable is that that's what Ken Kratz said too. Even he cast doubt on the actual date that Teresa Halbach was killed, which is very, very interesting. But according to Brendan, she was killed on the 31st of October. And according to Brendan, they drove the RAV4 around the perimeter. But according to the dog tracks, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't actually back up with what Brendan is saying.
Those dog tracks destroy this. Everything else aside, the dog tracks destroyed the state's case.
Correct. There's no doubt about that. That is absolutely correct. And everything that Brendan Dassey said, none of it could be corroborated. And a lot of the critical pieces of evidence used against Stephen actually came from the investigator's suggestion, not from Brendan himself. One Strand, do you have a comment?
I just have one question, just to clarify. When they were asking Brendan what he had done under the hood, what was the reason, excuse me, for them? Was there no battery? Was the old battery disconnected? Was there a different battery? What was the incidents around that?
Well, apparently there's an oversized battery in the Toyota RAV4 that doesn't normally belong in a Toyota RAV4. And I believe some researchers have pinpointed it to belonging from a police vehicle. So you've got a different battery that shouldn't be in the Toyota RAV4 that's got a disconnected battery cable. So
Crown Vic battery, I think, Dr. Silkman.
Correct. So therefore, how can one explain why Stephen Avery would swap out the normal Toyota RAV4 battery? Why would he want to do that? It just seems completely ludicrous. So yes, the reason why they were questioning him about the hood latch was because someone had disconnected the battery terminal. And Ken Kratz said, oh yeah, Stephen Avery did that to disconnect the alarm, right? The alarm. And I remember in a report, a recent report, when Kathleen Zellner was talking with Stephen Avery, he goes, look, I work with cars. I don't even need a key to start the car. I can hotwire the car if I was going to move it, or I use the end loader. So it doesn't make any sense. So this whole, and also the other thing, of course, is that when they questioned Brendan Dassey about why did Stephen go underneath the hood latch, underneath the hood, Brendan couldn't give them an answer why he would want to go under the hood, but he did say something. He said, oh, that's probably likely where Stephen Avery scratched himself to bleed, right? Which is incredible because Brendan Dassey gave 7 different excuses to how Stephen got blood on his finger. One of them was he scratched himself under the hood. And of course, if he did, he would have left blood everywhere. Neville, do you have a comment?
Yes, Zellner said in this episode that due to there was no mix of blood, Teresa and Stevens, that was such a huge red flag that they needed to come up with another fluid.
Correct.
Right? And that's why
correct.
Brendan had to confess, quote unquote.
Correct.
That's how
and so,
they came.
yes. And that, in fact, Ken Kratz wanted to make a big deal about that DNA on the hood latch by saying it was sweat. So remember, through the phone calls, it was discovered that Ken Kratz was obviously listening in because Stephen actually mentioned sweat, that he used to sweat during sex. So what does Ken Kratz do when he does the press conference on March the 2nd? Sweat this, sweat that, sweat this, and he even said sweat DNA. So he tried to make it a consistent story. But however, when the DNA expert did the experiment regarding the amount of DNA on the hood latch, it's inconsistent with touch DNA. Normally, you would leave a little bit of DNA. Stephen Avery left a huge amount of DNA, and also factor in that it was about 150 days after the Toyota RAV4 was found that they swabbed the hood latch, which means that the amount of degradation, that DNA level should have been much lower, right? So therefore, if you factor all of that, Stephen Avery left a huge amount of DNA on that hood latch, which is consistent with more like a groin swab, a rich source of DNA, not touching it with a finger. All right, guys, do we have any final questions? I'm sensitive of the time. We're nearly approaching 3 hours. Neverly.
Maz asked a long time ago, and we tried to answer her question, which was how they could even get away with this whole sweat DNA business when there's no such thing. How could they? First of all, I think that she asked, how could they have the nerve to even introduce it and then to run with it?
I think the main. Thank you, Mas, for that question. I think the main issue now that we can look back is that Buting and Strang did not hire a forensic DNA expert. By doing that, the expert would have been able to present similar findings to what Wright did, his analysis, and would have said, look, if that's touch DNA, how do you explain why there's at least a 26-fold increase in the amount of DNA? It can't be explained by just a good shed, a bad shedder, because that's a huge amount of DNA to leave. So what you want to do is what Kathleen Zellner wants to do is to undermine the confidence in the verdicts. So therefore you attack the forensic evidence. Dean Strang and Jerome Buting never did that. So a jury and a judge will think, okay, it's DNA, it's got to be Stephen in the party. But the reality is, if the DNA levels are inconsistent with what you would normally find, then you've got to start asking bigger questions. The mere factor that the laboratory was able to prove that it wasn't blood. So even if you didn't see the blood, there would have been blood proteins, right? So he proved that there was no blood, no saliva, obviously not urine, and obviously not semen. So therefore, it had to come from skin cells, right? And therefore, if it's touch DNA, you expect to find a certain level of DNA. What was found was something that was way beyond normal. Jack, 61.
Just a final comment and thought. Kratz knew that he had to get someone under that hood, and he used Brendan. Of course, we know he, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, no Brendan, no trial as we saw it. And I don't think he'd ever got a conviction because he had to get someone to alibi the state's side of it. And with all of these various pieces that he tried to plug into to Brendan to say, oh yeah, Stephen was under the hood. Oh yeah, to get, because that battery was the wrong one, and Kratz had to have done that. So
correct.
No Brendan, no trial as we saw it.
Correct. And in the and you know, Jack, in the 2010 post-conviction hearings, Ken Kratz admitted that the case against Stephen Avery was purely circumstantial.
Absolutely.
Purely circumstantial. and that they didn't use any of Brendan Dassey's testimony. But now, with hindsight, we can now break down his coercion version and completely destroy it. So the dog track proved that Brendan Dassey had no idea what happened to the RAV4, because if the RAV4 had come down the inside the salvage yard, the dogs would have been all over the place. Why? Because you've got fresh blood, fresh scent. Those dogs can detect scent for apparently a very long period of time, but the dogs didn't concentrate there. Dogs concentrated predominantly off the salvage yard. And the critical thing is the dogs provided a clue as to how material was brought onto the salvage yard. They went through the cornfield, the back entrance. So if you bring in burn barrels, electronics, bones, whatever, that's the way to do it. No one will even know you did it. Lily, do you have a comment?
Well, just a final one from myself also, and I've said it before, is it was perception.
Correct.
Kratz was able to talk his way into convicting Avery
Correct.
because overall there really wasn't anything there. Perception.
Correct.
It can, the damage that it can do is unbelievable.
Correct. It was all about perception, and it was about fooling people. I remember he even wrote an email to Sheree Cohen, and even mentioned the fact in that email that it was all about perception, how people saw things. And this case is really all about DNA. And if you don't have a good understanding of what DNA is all about and how it can be overinterpreted and misused, and how easy it is to plant, right? How very easy it is to plant. You could understand that with Kratz, in this case, it was all smoke and mirrors. That's precisely what Kathleen Zellner is doing. She's working hard to deconstruct the state's case. She's already done it with, we can see, she's already done it with item FL. She's done it with the distribution of the blood within the Toyota RAV4. And now she's used powerful evidence with the dog tracks. So I think, if she can get to present her case in front of a judge, it's going to look very, very bad for the state. And I think they know it. All right, guys. Do we have any final comments, guys? Because I think we're approaching 3 hours, and most of us need to go to the supermarket and see if we can find some toilet paper and hand sanitizer. So I know in Australia, don't come to Australia because we've run out. One Strand, do you have any final comment?
I already got my toilet paper. If any of you need some, I'll send you a roll. Just let me know.
So you're the one that emptied out was it Walmart?
The Costco.
Walmart, Food Lion. Yeah, I've hit them all.
Oh, my Lord. All right. Well, look, guys, I want to thank, first of all, the panel for their great support and great comments and great analysis. I'd like to thank all of our supporters for joining us on the podcast. Guys, if you like what we do, please leave your DNA on the like button. If we've made a mistake or you've got any further suggestions, guys, we're not perfect. We can make mistakes. I'm definitely not an expert on the dogs. And I urge all of you guys to check out McGiller's work, analysis that he's done on the dogs. Excellent work. And hopefully we can get McGiller on one of our podcasts to have a chat about that. I reckon that the audience will find it really, really fascinating. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Please join us in chat on Discord if you like to continue the discussion. But guys, thank you so much. Yes, I do apologize. Today's podcast was very lengthy, but clearly you can see that we're now getting into the nitty-gritty of the case, which is precisely what Kathleen Zellner is going to do in front of a judge if she could ever get her day in court. Okay, guys. Thank you so much. Neverly, do you have a final comment?
You don't have to apologize for the lengthy podcast, Dr. Silkman. I mean, how many channels have their own DNA expert? Come on. This is great.
Yeah, but I'm also very fortunate, guys, that I've got you guys, because you all have talent, and together we work as a team. That's the way to do it.
It
Sammy,
was
do you
my
have a final
pleasure.
comment?
My pleasure. And I want to thank all of the viewers, all of the people that show up and who are helping us make all this noise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, guys. Hopefully, coronavirus withstanding, we will catch you all next week. Thank you so much.
This has been a Foul Play production.